Imagine coming home after a long day, only to find your own driveway stolen from you. Not once, but again and again. For months, one man's peace was shattered by a neighbor who believed the rules didn't apply to her. But when patience turned to action, what followed wasn't just about a car being towed. It became a public downfall so dramatic the entire neighborhood witnessed it unfold. This isn't just a story about property lines. It's about entitlement, power, and what happens when someone finally stands up to injustice. Reginald Carter was the kind of man who carried patience like armor. As a middle school science teacher in Lakeland, Florida, he had to. Every day, he stood before restless classrooms filled with kids more interested in their phones than the periodic table, trying to make learning exciting in a world that often felt distracted. His job was demanding, but he had a rhythm, a balance that kept him steady. At the end of the day, his modest brick home was his sanctuary. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, and the driveway just big enough for his car and the occasional guest. It wasn't a mansion, but it was his place of peace, where he could grade papers, watch the game, and enjoy the quiet dignity of homeownership. But for some people, dignity wasn't something they respected. And for Reginald, that realization came in the form of his next-door neighbor, a woman who treated boundaries as suggestions and respect as optional. Her name was Blythe Vanderholt, and she had a habit that slowly turned into a nightmare. She began using Reginald's driveway as if it were her own. At first, Reginald brushed it off. The first time he saw her silver Lexus parked in his driveway, he assumed it was a mistake. Maybe she had guests over. Maybe she was rearranging cars. It seemed harmless enough, but the pattern didn't stop. Again and again, he'd come home. To find her car occupying the space meant for his. Each time, she carried herself with the quiet arrogance of someone who had never been told no. And there was another layer to it. Reginald couldn't ignore the way her dismissiveness carried weight, the way she brushed him aside as if his frustration didn't matter, as if his rights didn't matter. It wasn't just about a driveway. It was about who she thought she could disrespect and who she thought she could walk over. Neighbors in communities like theirs knew the truth well. Not everyone was treated equally. Some residents got warnings, others got punished. Some were believed, others dismissed. And Reginald had lived long enough to recognize when someone thought they had power over him simply because of who he was. For weeks, he tried to keep calm. He left notes that disappeared. He knocked on doors that conveniently went unanswered. Each time he saw her vehicle blocking his space, the quiet sanctuary he had worked for felt invaded, stolen. To Blythe, it was just a few minutes. But to him, it was a pattern of entitlement. Reginald's patience was steady, but it was not infinite. Because what started as a nuisance was about to turn into a battle, one that would unravel in front of an entire neighborhood. A battle where race, power, and privilege collided on the simple concrete of a driveway. Reginald had always believed in handling things the right way. He gave people chances, assumed misunderstandings could be cleared up, and tried to avoid unnecessary conflict. But the longer Blythe's silver Lexus appeared in his driveway, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was entitlement. The situation escalated when Reginald returned home one evening, tired from a full day at school, only to find not one but two cars in his driveway. Alongside the familiar Lexus sat a shiny black BMW, neither of which belonged to him. His sanctuary, his one place of peace, had become a parking lot for people who didn't even live there. He knocked on Blythe's door, firm and calm, but her response was as casual as if he were asking about the weather. It was just her friend. It wasn't a big deal. To her, his frustration was irrelevant and his boundaries invisible. That night, for the first time, Reginald considered calling a towing company, but before taking that step, he tried something else. He went to the homeowners association, the very group meant to protect residents when neighbors crossed the line. If anyone could enforce boundaries, surely it would be them. Except that the moment he explained the situation, he realized what he was up against. Blythe wasn't just a neighbor. She was a board member, practically untouchable within the HOA. Unless there's damage to your property, the representative told him, we don't get involved in personal disputes. Reginald hung up the phone, the bitter truth settling in. Rules weren't the same for everyone. Influence mattered, appearance mattered, and in neighborhoods like his, race often tilted the scales. He'd seen it before. One set of rules for some, another for others. And once again, he was on the side expected to stay quiet. Still, he gave Blythe one last chance. A bold note in thick black marker left squarely on her windshield. Do not park here again. That evening, he came home to find the note gone, and her car angled carelessly across his driveway as if mocking his request. The frustration wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was about the message her actions carried. Your word doesn't matter here. And when she laughed at his concerns, dismissing him as uptight over something so small, it confirmed what he already knew. She wasn't going to stop. That night, sitting at his kitchen table, Reginald felt a shift inside him. The patience that had carried him through years of classroom chaos, that had held him steady through quiet indignities, finally cracked. This wasn't about avoiding conflict anymore. It was about dignity, respect, boundaries. The next time she parked in his driveway, he didn't knock. He didn't leave a note. He didn't call the HOA. He called the tow truck. Within 20 minutes, the driver arrived, efficient and unquestioning. Proof of property ownership was shown, the chains were hooked in place, and the Lexus was lifted off the concrete. For the first time in weeks, Reginald stood tall in his driveway, arms crossed, watching as her vehicle disappeared down the street. The silence afterward wasn't just relief. It was power reclaimed. And Reginald knew this was only the beginning. Because people like Blythe didn't take losses quietly, and what came next would turn a neighborhood dispute into a public spectacle. The first tow should have been enough. Most people would have taken the hint, swallowed their pride, and moved on. But not Blythe. For her, losing control was unthinkable, and instead of backing down, she escalated. That very night, Reginald's front door shook under the pounding of her fists. She demanded answers, her face flushed with outrage. She threatened him with her connections, insisting that as an HOA board member, she had power he didn't. But when the police arrived, expecting to mediate a heated dispute, the truth was undeniable. Her car had been removed from his property, legally. She was left standing on her porch, embarrassed and furious, as the officers told her there was nothing they could do. But Blythe wasn't done. If she couldn't win with the police, she'd use her influence elsewhere. Within days, the complaints began. Anonymous notes about Reginald's lawn, HOA letters about supposed violations, his plants, his trash bins, even the paint on his mailbox. Each claim was more absurd than the last, and everyone knew where they came from. Still, the pettiness didn't end there. She began calling security on him, reporting suspicious activity whenever he stepped outside. Once, as he watered his lawn, a patrol car pulled up. Lights flashing, officer stepping out with a stern look. Reginald knew instantly who had called. And sure enough, when he glanced toward Blythe's porch, there she stood, watching, arms crossed, waiting for him to stumble. But Reginald refused to give her what she wanted. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He stood calmly, handed over. Proof that he lived there, and told the officer to let her find a new hobby. Then, with quiet confidence, he turned his back and walked inside. Her attempts to provoke him only exposed her desperation. And the neighborhood was watching. The second tow sealed it. On a sunny Saturday, with his family arriving for a cookout, Reginald came home to find her Lexus blocking not just his driveway, but his garage. This time, he didn't hesitate. He called the tow company, unfolded a chair on his porch, and sat waiting with a bottle of water in hand. The truck arrived, the chains hooked, and as the Lexus lifted off the ground again, Blythe came storming out, shrieking as if a crime were unfolding before her eyes. Neighbors peeked through blinds, stepped onto porches, whispered as the scene unfolded. She screamed that it was unfair. She accused him of being petty. She insisted her guests had nowhere else to park. But Reginald didn't flinch. He simply gestured to the tow truck, hauling her car away, and said nothing. By the time the Lexus disappeared down the street, the entire block had witnessed it. Blythe's arrogance laid bare, her power slipping. She stood trembling with rage, humiliated not in private but in front of the very community she had once ruled. For the first time, the imbalance shifted. And for Reginald, the moment was more than a victory. It was justice. But Blythe wasn't finished yet, because for her, this was no longer about a driveway. It was about control. And when control is threatened, some people will do anything to get it back. The second tow should have ended things. Any reasonable person would have realized the fight was lost. But Blythe wasn't reasonable, not when it came to control. Losing face in front of the neighborhood was something she couldn't accept. And so, she doubled down. Within days, the community email went out. Carefully worded, vague, dripping with passive-aggressive undertones, it painted the situation as a dispute that had escalated unnecessarily, a not-so-subtle attempt to make Reginald look like the aggressor. Soon after, laminated flyers appeared on mailboxes. Is this the kind of community we want? Do we tow our neighbors instead of talking to them? It was desperate, dramatic, and above all, ineffective. The neighbors weren't fooled. They had seen Blythe's behavior for years. They'd endured her fines for small, meaningless violations. They'd watched her weaponize the HOA against anyone she didn't like. And now, her downfall wasn't just public. It was welcomed. Texts and calls began pouring into Reginald's phone. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet now voiced their support. Parents from the school where he taught reached out in disbelief over her antics. Some even joked about splitting tow fees if she ever dared park in his driveway again. What Blythe thought would ruin his reputation only strengthened it. And then came the HOA meeting. Reginald rarely attended, but this time he went and sat in the front row. The atmosphere was tense. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs about budgets, landscaping, and recycling schedules. But that night, the room buzzed with anticipation. Blythe sat tall, prepared to play the victim, ready to twist the narrative in her favor. Yet when the agenda turned to community concerns, the script flipped. A board member cleared his throat and announced the issue wasn't with Reginald. It was with Blythe herself. The words cut sharper than any tow truck chain. Multiple reports of harassment, misuse of security, and abuse of HOA authority. Blythe's composure cracked. She sputtered excuses, claimed she was being targeted, accused the board of betrayal. But the room had turned cold. Even her allies remained silent. One by one, neighbors shared their stories. Fines over harmless decorations, threats for minor violations, constant intimidation. For years, Blythe had ruled over the HOA like a queen with unchecked power. That night, the crown slipped, and the spiral didn't stop there. A few days later, Reginald pulled into his driveway and noticed his trash bins missing. Not tipped over, not misplaced. Gone. His search ended behind Blythe's house, where they sat stacked neatly, as if she had taken them in a final desperate act of defiance. He snapped photos, calmly documented the theft, and when he knocked on her door, her face told the whole story. No smug smile, no sarcastic tone. Just exhaustion. She had lost the war she started. Reginald filed a formal complaint with the HOA, backed by evidence and supported by neighbors. The outcome was swift and decisive. Blythe was removed from the HOA board. Stripped of her influence, her voice no longer carried weight. For the first time in years, the community was free from her grip. In the weeks that followed, Blythe kept her distance. She stopped speaking to Reginald, avoided eye contact, and eventually retreated into silence. No cars in his driveway, no notes on his door. No fabricated complaints. The quiet felt like victory. But the real impact wasn't just personal. The neighborhood itself began to change. People who had once been afraid to challenge her started to speak up. Stories poured out. A boy harassed for wearing a hoodie. Families fined for harmless decorations. Neighbors called out for imagined violations. For years, she had used power to divide. But now, her collapse brought people together. And then, the final sign of defeat appeared, a for sale sign planted firmly in her front yard. Whether from shame, pressure, or the simple fact that she had too many enemies, Blythe was leaving. Moving trucks came and went, and one quiet morning, she was gone. Reginald stood on his porch as the last truck pulled away. He breathed in the silence of a driveway that was finally, unquestionably his again. No silver Lexus, no unwanted battles, just peace. The neighborhood never forgot her downfall. People still whispered about the woman who had once ruled the HOA and lost everything over arrogance and entitlement. But for Reginald, the story was never just about one neighbor. It was about what happens when boundaries are tested, when patience is exploited, and when respect is denied. Because sometimes injustice doesn't come loudly. It comes in small acts of entitlement, repeated until they erode peace and dignity. And sometimes it takes just one person standing firm to shift the balance. Blythe learned the hard way. Power built on disrespect will always crumble. And Reginald proved something far greater. That when you stand your ground, you don't just defend your own dignity. You give others the courage to defend theirs, too. So the next time someone believes they can take without consequence, the question remains: how long before the world finally makes them answer for it?